Welcome to One More for the Road, our talk, or one of the talks, for our virtual Leaping Hare. One More for the Road is going to explore the ancient Roman understanding of the lares, viales, the spirits of the roadway, and look at similar ideas in other cultures. And so we begin, of course, with omnes viae Romam ducant, all roads lead to Rome, as they used to say, the great hub of all the road networks of Europe. In ancient times, amongst the Romans and arguably the Britons, the Germanic tribes, the Egyptians, the Greeks, a whole raft of tribes of the world over, roadways were seen as living entities, beings with their own soul, their own mind, their own wishes, their likes, their dislikes, beings that could be negotiated with by travellers, by anybody setting out, whether on foot or horseback or in a wagon or whatever other means of transport they were using, to journey from one place to another, who would want a safe journey, want, if they were going by wagon, their wagon to arrive with all four wheels still intact. If they were going on horseback, they wanted to arrive not only with themselves alive and in one piece, but also their horses. So offerings were made to the spirits of the roadway, to the gods of travel, for a safe journey out and a safe journey back. But that was in the old days, and these days, 21st century, how many people, pagan, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, atheist, agnostic, or whatever they may be, how many people these days make an offering to the spirits of the roadways when they're setting out on a journey of any significant length, or even maybe a relatively short journey? Possibly there are still quite a few Catholics who will say a prayer to St. Christopher when they're embarking on a long journey, but relatively few in other contexts, I suspect. And indeed, if we're thinking about modern day 21st century pagan attitudes to roads, there are quite a few modern day pagans who will get involved in signing petitions, chaining themselves to trees, going on protests, waving placards and one thing and another, in protest against the building of new roads, especially obviously where that's going through pristine woodland or other sites of great natural significance. And as well as concerns about the overabundance of new roads in unnecessary areas, even with old and existing roads, there's a lot of concerns around the amount of pollution belched out by cars, around the amount of traffic jams and traffic accidents and all sorts of problems that ensue with roads, and they're seen in an increasingly negative light rather than being seen as spiritual beings to be honoured and respected. So perhaps by the end of this talk, for those of you who do not currently regard roads in a sacred light, I might have succeeded in getting you to rethink a little bit, at least, about your approach to roadways. Now, whilst the lares of the viales of the roads are the spirits of those ancient Roman roads, and by extension any other road, the lares compitales are the spirits of the crossroads where two roads meet. Now, why indeed are crossroads places of such sanctity? Well, we'll get onto that as we go along, but they are slightly different in nature from a Roman perspective, at least, if not necessarily in modern times, because some of the practices of ancient Rome that made compitales such significant places no longer really exist in most modern day communities. But we'll get onto those as we go along. Now, the figure you see in the photograph is carrying a chriton, that cornucopia, the horn of plenty that you can see bunches of grapes and various things hanging out of the top of it. A chriton is simply a hollowed out horn, or either a natural animal horn or a metal one made in the shape of an animal's horn, which is used to pour out libations, whether that's libations of wine or food. The figure has its other hand upraised in the air. Once upon a time there would have been a plate held in that hand, a patera, on which other offerings were made, food offerings. So quite typically the chriton contained liquid offerings, and the patera contained bread or fruit or meat or vegetables of one description or another. And whilst there are no particular serpents in this figure in the photograph, many of the depictions of lares have them encircled or with serpents around their feet, and the snake, the household snake, was seen as a representative of the spirit of the lar. And it's worth bearing in mind that still in a number of cultures around the world, snakes, rather than being feared or an object of concern, are actually seen, rather in the same light as cats, as a useful animal for keeping vermin away, keeping down rats and mice and other annoying creatures that you don't want around your house eating your food or spreading disease. So the serpent was a beneficial creature rather than the kind of sinister creature it was perceived as within Christianity. Sad to say, dog lovers, you might want to block your ears at this juncture. The belt that the figure is wearing is almost certainly meant to be made of dog skin. At least this is what Plutarch tells us, that back in the day the sacrifice of animals was a very common and regular practice. What benefit was this to the spirits in question? Sometimes that's a difficult question to answer, but it may be that the spirit sometimes took on the soul of the animal as a friend, a companion, an assistant, but also perhaps that sometimes they used the skin, the bones, the meat, the feathers, the very essence of the creature sacrificed to it, as material from which to make clothing, from which to make tools. And so the dog skin belt becomes associated with the lar. And of course the dog, like the snake, is a guardian of the house, of the home, a protector, a shield. Lars, whether they were lars of homes or the lares of roads or the lares of temples or the lares of anywhere else, those lares were first and foremost guardian spirits. So the question then becomes, what are these lares? Well, for those who lived in rural areas, not in the great city of Rome itself, but in the various other rural settlements that the Roman Empire encompassed, a lot of people in rural settlements would be living on the same farm that their parents had once owned, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, their great-great-grandparents, going back to the year dot. Whilst it was a standard practice in cities and large towns to inter the dead, usually cremated outside of the walls, in some rural communities, in certain locations in Italy, but also in a number of other surrounding cultures, like the Germanic and the Scandinavian cultures, would be interred in the land itself. So either their bodies would be buried or their ashes would be buried on the farmland. And there would be a particular location where those ashes or bones were interred. And so not only would you be farming the same land as your parents and grandparents and so forth, but those very parents and grandparents and great aunts and great uncles and every other relative going would be part of the soil that you lived on. There would be a patch on the edge of your settlement where all of your relatives had been interred over the course of many, many decades, if not centuries, and where one day you fully expected to be interred yourself. So the land and the dead became one and the same. And there was the belief that, just as within Christianity, the majority of the dead are simply dead, that certain favoured few become saints. They are dead people, but they are elevated to a special status. So it's the case, and possibly this is where Christianity got the idea from, so it's the case that in quite a number of cultures, the majority of the dead are dead, and they're off doing whatever the dead get up to. But some of them, a chosen few, are elevated to a special status. They are elevated to the status of guardians, of protectors of their own bloodline, of protectors of particular areas of land with which they and their descendants have become heavily associated. So the lar of the house was once your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, grandmother, who has now become a guardian spirit. Is this also true of the lar of the road? Possibly. We'll get on to that as we go along. Other questions remain to be asked when it comes to roads as well as to houses and temples and so forth. What was there in the land before the road was created? or the house built, or the temple erected. If there was a meadow, if there was a woodland, if there was a field that was ploughed away with to make way for this road or this house or this temple, what happened to the spirits of the meadow, the spirits of the woodland, the spirits of the land? Are they still there, or have they gone entirely? Died with the cutting down of their trees? If they're still there, do they become part and parcel of whatever it is that has replaced them? So does the spirit of the woodland become part of the spirit of the home that is now constructed on the place where the woodland used to be? Or the spirit of the meadow becomes part of the roadway that is now thrust straight through where the meadow used to be? Do they become part and parcel of it? Then we also have to think about whether it's with houses or with roadways. That house might be built of wood, it might be built of stone, of slates, of all sorts of materials. The roadway will be made out of tarmac, of hardcore and all sorts of other materials. Those materials have all come from other places to be brought there. And those materials were once part of the earth, part of forests in the case of the wooden timbers in a building. Part of mountains, perhaps, where it was stone unearthed from a quarry somewhere. Do those raw materials have spirit, have soul? When they're transferred from their natural place of rest to become part of a house, part of a temple, part of a roadway, do they lose their spirit, or does that spirit fuse to become the guardian of the new building, of the new road, of the new whatever it happens to be? Maybe it's a little bit of all of the above, or at least 2 out of 3, if not all of the above. Lots of other cultures around the world have the notion of guardian spirits, particularly household spirits. The Koth goddess within Saxon and other Germanic traditions, the Bokken of Gaelic tradition, the Domovoi of Russian tradition, Toncha, the little gnomes in Sweden, and the Haljas in Finland. And we could go on and on and on, looking at culture after culture after culture, which has examples of little household gods, little household guardian spirits, with whom the family that live in the house are advised to get on good terms with the making of regular offerings. And if that is true of households, it's true of factories, of hospitals, of colleges and schools. It's true, perhaps, of mobile objects. Does a ship have a guardian spirit? Well, back in the day when ships had figureheads, wooden ships had figureheads, usually female but sometimes male, that figurehead was the guardian spirit of the ship. Sailors back in the day of sail ships and wooden ships strongly believed that their vessels had guardian spirits. And I dare say there's probably quite a few sailors around these days, now we're into vast metal ships, who still believe that those vast metal ships have guardian spirits. If a ship has a spirit, does a car have a spirit? What about a train? What about a plane? What about anything that has been constructed? That spirit could be a combination of the raw materials that have gone into the making of the vehicle, as well as the blood, sweat and tears of all of the people involved in manufacturing that article. Obviously, these days a lot of things like cars are churned out on factory lines, as much made by robots as they are made by the occasional human involved in the process. A far-flung removal from a few centuries ago, when a wagon would be made entirely by hand and literally have the sweat and the tears and occasionally the blood of the carpenters involved in creating that wagon. But even so, that car, even if it has been made by robots by and large, will be driven by humans, one human after another, after another, after another, and perhaps we leave our essence within the vehicle until the vehicle becomes animate, becomes present, and that is part of the being that keeps us safe. Dite in columnum custodiant. May the gods keep you safe. And likewise, invoco vos lares viales ut me benedictis. I call on you, lare viales, guardians of my well-being. How do we call upon them? When do we call upon them? Well, the Romans called upon them within their ritual calendar. They had the festivals of Pettalia, the festivals of the spirits of the crossroads. One took place early in January. The exact date was not fixed. It floated around according to various different factors. And another took place on March the 16th, not long gone. What did the Romans do at these festivities? Well, they gathered at the crossroads during the evening, when vehicles were no longer allowed to be travelling on the crossroads. And obviously, if you want to do a modern day equivalent of this, do bear in mind health and safety. Don't go and get yourself run over by standing in the middle of a busy crossroads. Think about how to do it safely. But the Romans, in safety, gathered at the crossroads at night with burning torches and oil lamps and so forth. And they would erect yugum. A yugum was a four-sided shrine, four-sided to reflect the four rows of the crossroad. Think of it a little bit like almost like a birdhouse kind of an arrangement, a small wooden shrine put up by the roadside. And for each of the family members gathering to participate in this ritual, they would have a doll made out of wood, one for each person, the manier. Dare say Great Aunt Julia might have been going mad with the knitting needles and making the dolls for every member of the family. The slaves did not warrant a doll, but each slave owned by the family was represented by a small ball of wool. In these somewhat kinder times, we of course no longer own slaves. Well, not legally anyway. You hear the occasional scandalous tale, but it's no longer legal to own slaves. So you could simply drop that bit of the ritual entirely from your practice if you want to have a go at doing this type of ritual. Or you might consider that in ancient Roman times, what were the slaves there for? Well, they did things like sweeping the house, washing the clothes, all of the heavy manual chores that the lady and lord of the house didn't want to do themselves. Who do we have to do that for us these days? Well, I suppose if you're rich enough to employ Mrs. Mop to come round and push a broom about, you could put a ball of wool for Mrs. Mop. Or more likely, you'll probably have washing machines and hoovers and dishwashers and such like things to do the jobs that once upon a time slaves would have been doing. So perhaps you could, as a bit of whimsy, have a ball of wool for each of your appliances around the house that do such jobs. The slaves participated in these rituals along with their families, which was fairly unusual for the majority of rituals. That didn't happen. But the slaves would have hoods up, so they would be incognito, and even though I'm quite sure everybody would have known exactly who they were, they pretended not to know who they were and treated them as honoured guests for the duration of the ritual, at least. There's also an element of honouring the lares during weddings. So the paterfamilias, the father of the bride, would leave one coin under the hearth of the family home for the guardian spirits of the home, and leave one coin at the crossroads for the compitaliers, the guardians of the crossroads. Well, I suppose the idea there being that getting married was setting out on a great journey in life, and there would be many choices as are faced at a crossroads. You could turn east or north or south or west, and so the guardians of the crossroads were seen as particularly significant for protecting the journey in life of the newly married couple. And it's possible that may be understood in other ways that we'll allude to as we go along. But pro itu et reditu, the departure and the return. What do you do as you go out? What do you do as you come back upon your journey in life? What would you expect to find of a roadside shrine? Well, Apuleius gives us descriptions of various different roadside shrines. He speaks of an altar ringed with floral wreaths, a grotto shaded by leafy boughs, an oak adorned with horns, a beech crowned with skins, an isolated rock surrounded by an enclosure, a tree trunk carved into a human shape, a meadow filled with a smoke of libations, a stone drenched in perfumes. Wonderfully evocative images, and you might have found any of these along the ancient Roman roadways. and stopped a while on your journey to make an offering of your own, to add your own perfumes, your own smoky libations, your own floral wreaths, and so on. These days, that's not quite such a common sight, except, of course, for anyone listening to this who is Irish, or has been on holiday to Ireland, or lived over there for a while. You'll notice that any journey along an Irish road, it won't be too very long before you pass by a shrine, a roadside shrine, almost invariably to the Virgin Mary. Occasionally to a saint, but mostly to the Virgin Mary. And often these roadside shrines are erected in spots along the road where it will be remarkably inadvisable to kneel down and pray in front of it, because you'd probably get run over. They're not put in convenient spots, they're put in all sorts of spots. And the expectation is not quite so much that people will be kneeling down in front of them on a regular basis, but rather that the drivers and passengers whizzing past will see the shrine and bow their head, make the sign of the cross, mutter a prayer, ask the Virgin to ensure their safety upon the road. We could also think about those somewhat sadder roadside shrines that are erected in places where people have been run over or killed in a car crash. As per the photograph there, often it's offerings of flowers, photographs, sometimes a poem or a prayer is printed out and glued up to a nearby telegraph pole or traffic light pole or whatever it might be that's convenient to put it to, a reminder of the dead. Those are modern day offerings to the dead of the road. And we come back to this argument, an idea that once upon a time on farmland you would have had your ancestors buried on the land, and one of those ancestors had become the lar, the guardian spirit of the farm or of the family who live on the farm. Well, the roads too have their dead. The dead are not buried in the roads anymore, but they have their dead, the blood that has seeped into the tarmac, gruesomely enough. Is it possible that one or other of them might become a spirit of the roadway? Perhaps. In ancient times, we know, because we're told, that they made offerings of honey cakes, and sometimes would kill a chicken, spill the blood upon the road, and then cook the chicken. Some of the cooked meat might well have been put back upon the road and the rest eaten by the family, because it was always important to share the food offerings. Tarquinius Superbus thought it possible, he wasn't around when this happened, but thought it possible that in distant times, distant even by his standards, that slaves might have been sacrificed and their blood spilled upon the road. He wasn't sure, but he thought it was a possibility, rather graphic possibility. Junius Brutus somewhat more kindly suggested, well, if that ever did happen, and the Romans were not keen to admit to a heritage of human sacrifice, because they saw that as particularly barbaric and the kind of thing that very dodgy foreigners get up to, not decent, upstanding Romans. It was indeed one of the accusations they made against the Druids, to prove what dodgy foreigners they were, that they engaged in human sacrifice, supposedly. So Brutus suggested, well, even if they did sacrifice humans at an early stage, very rapidly they moved on to other things as they became more civilized, and those other things included garlic bulbs and poppy seeds, poppy heads, crushed into the road. On a bleak moment, and this may be very bleak because it may well directly affect some of the people listening to this, who have perhaps lost friends or relatives or pets to the roads. Spirits, as we know through ancient cultures and still many modern day polytheist cultures, make requests. Those requests might be for garlic and poppy heads, it might be for honey cakes, it might be for wine, it might be for song or poetry or a whole raft of other possibilities. If the requests of the spirits are not met willingly, or even listened to or heard in the first place, does the spirit simply sit there and pout, or does the spirit take action and seize unwillingly that which it is not given willingly? I know plenty of people who are convinced that their household spirits, when they are disgruntled, hide socks and keys and such like things until such time as they are appeased and listened to. Would these spirits of the roadways, the lares, viales, be any different? If they are not given willing offerings, will they take offerings in more gruesome ways? There's a dark, dark thought for you, and it's been a topic for one of my as yet unpublished short stories. Maybe we need to get back to offerings, honey cakes, or garlic bulbs, or whatever it is that the roads want these days. Perhaps if we gave more freely, they would demand less often. And it's worth a thought whether these spontaneous roadside shrines that go up these days are a 21st century manifestation of a primal wish to recognise and honour the spirits of the road. So even though the shrines are dedicated to wives and daughters and brothers and fathers and sons, rather than roadside spirits, is it meeting a deeper need? It's very un-Christian to honour the dead at the place where they died. The standard practice within Christianity is theoretically Christian country. The standard practice, of course, is to go to the grave. And if you want to leave offerings of flowers, you leave them at the grave. You don't leave them in the place where Grandad died. But an enormously large number of people do exactly that. People, some of whom are Christians, some of whom are atheists or Buddhists or pagans or Hindus or whatever they might be, will nonetheless go and create a shrine, a dedication, not at the place where their relative is buried, but at the place where their relative gasped their last, at the edge of the roadside. And there are some councils who have taken to creating what you might term fake shrines of this sort, even where no death has occurred, because they've worked out that when drivers whiz past one of these gatherings of flowers and wreaths, they slow down. And so there are councils who have used these sometimes made-up shrines to slow down traffic and prevent accidents, which, if it's a little cynical, at least probably works. So the food of the god Deorum Cibus Est. That is the food of the gods. Honey cakes and poppy heads and garlic. Animum adere. To eat the soul, to consume the soul. There is a even darker side to this. I think we're getting fairly dark as it is, with talk of roadside spirits requiring offerings even when they're not given voluntarily. For the Greeks, one of the titles of Hecate, goddess of the moon, goddess of magic, goddess of graveyards, once upon a time in early Greece a great mother goddess, before she became seen as this much darker figure. One of her titles was Enodia, Hecate of the roadways. Hecate who guards the passage of spirits, the toing and froing of spirits, particularly unhappy spirits, tormented spirits, the spirits of those who died by violence, the spirits of those who took their own lives, the spirits of those who might have been executed for taking the lives of others, and the spirits of those whom the living fear have become vampires and predators in the afterlife. It's a common practice up until really surprisingly recently in many parts of the world, not just Roman-occupied parts of the world, but many other parts of the world too, for the corpses of suicides and executed murderers and people suspected of being likely vampires, perhaps because they had been known to engage in occult practices during their lifetime, for their corpses to be buried directly under the crossroads. So literally digging up the middle part of the crossroads, putting the body in and then filling it back up again. Why did they do this? Well, it may be a distant recollection of the days in which Hecate was widely acknowledged as the guardian of the crossroads, who would keep the spirit contained within the crossroads. But later on, as Hecate faded from popular memory, There were cultures who argued that these tormented ghosts and predatory spirits were so dithery that when they awoke at dusk, as darkness spread across the land, they would find themselves at the crossroads and they wouldn't know whether to turn east or north or south or west. So they would stand and and ah and dither and faff and still be faffing when it was time for the dawn to arise in the east and force them back into the shadowy recesses of their graves. Are the dead, are vampires really that indecisive? I don't know, I've never actually met one. But possibly so. But then again, maybe it is the power of Hecate rather than the indecisiveness of vampires that's the key factor here. So the compitales, those guardian spirits of the roadways, and we could speculate whether, again going back to this idea of guardian spirits being at least partially ancestral figures, if someone has been buried at the roadway, at the crossroads, are they entirely a figure of torment and darkness, or do they mutate to become a guardian spirit, like a neighbourhood watch keeping an eye on the angry, tormented, dangerous shades of the underworld, making sure that they don't cause too much grief and misery for the living? Of course, occasionally you get stories of naive people who go to crossroads at the dark of night and there find the dithery vampire who finally gets fed, because for once dinner has come to the vampire rather than the vampire having to go to dinner. One of the other possible reasons of the importance of the crossroads of the Compitale is that in Roman times it was quite customary for the four quarters delineated by a crossroads to contain blocks of houses and buildings, each of which was mostly occupied by extended members of a particular family. So pretty much everyone living in that particular block would be father, mother, child, aunt, uncle, grandparents, cousins, second cousins, and so forth. They'd all be interrelated in some shape, form or guise. And so the four different blocks of housing which were marked out by the crossroads would contain four different family groupings. And sometimes those family groupings could fall out with each other. We all know what it's like to be neighbours. Sometimes you rub each other up the wrong way. And so the crossroads became like a no man's land, an area that was not the property of any one of those four, but a neutral territory between the four families. And they would come there for meetings, not just for rituals, but for discussions on neutral territory about matters of mutual interest or about matters over which they'd fallen out with one another. It was a safe space, a meeting place, a bringing together of people from different, potentially rival, potentially hostile communities to meet in peace, to negotiate and come to an accord. And so the guardian spirits, the compitales, were as much diplomatic spirits overseeing these comings together as they were spirits that watched the dead and spirits that watched the traffic. Vacatus atque non vacatus Deus aderit. Bidden or not, the god is present. And that's a reminder that the spirits are always there whether we conjure them forth or not. So you can call forth a spirit, but a spirit is actually already there in the first place, if it wants to be there. And if it doesn't want to be there, no amount of conjuring forth is going to change its mind. These are just a small example. We won't go over all of them because it will get terribly dull. But a small sample of deities from various different cultures who are associated with travel and roadways and safe journeying. So Min of ancient Egypt, for example, San Ellen of Wales, who is both goddess and eventually saint. San being an old Welsh word for a roadway, a sacred roadway. And I know that there will be people listening to this who are devotees of Ellen. We'll come back to her later in this talk. The Phrygians of Scotland, Kimiakinus, an ancient Romano-British deity who was a guardian of roadways. The Dosajon of Japan, Shinto entities, beings, kami, that look after travellers and roadways. Baron Samedi in Voodoo, the practices of the Yoruba tribe, which, well, Voodoo is a bit of a mislabel really, but the god of graveyards as well as the god of crossroads, and of course St. Christopher himself within the Christian tradition. And there are others. Which brings us back to Flag Fen and the ancient Britons who built wooden roadways. Ad astra per aspera, through hardship we attain the stars. Keep going and you'll get to somewhere good eventually. Worth bearing in mind at this particular juncture in British history. Some of you at least will have been to Flag Fen, and if you haven't, there's very little left of it these days, but once upon a time Flag Fen in Peterborough was a huge marshy area in which the local British tribes, at enormous effort, had brought planks of wood and great staves, great pillars like you can see in the drawing there, and constructed roadways across the swampy areas. Now, some of these roadways may have been used for just comings and goings between different communities and hunting grounds and food gathering areas and so forth, but some of them also went out to the middle of the swamp, and the roadway, the footway, then broadened out into a large, almost round platform in the middle of swamp, so it went nowhere essentially except to this platform. And the assumption made by the archaeologists is that people would walk along this particular walkway as a sort of like a ritualistic pilgrimage and gather in large numbers on the great round platform for ceremonial purposes. Quite what those ceremonies were, nobody knows anymore. It could have been weddings, it could have been festivals geared to the summer or the winter, the solstices or the equinoxes. It could have been for funerals, it could have been for any number of significant gatherings. But quite possibly a key feature of most of these gatherings would have been the making of offerings into the water from the edge of the platform. Possibly so. So not all roads necessarily link place A to place B. Sometimes they link place A to somewhere mysterious and liminal and strange. Returning to Ellen, the goddess of roadways, or one of the goddesses of the roadways, an argument has been put forth by various different historians and mystical pagan types that back in ancient times, the kind of period of history we're talking about with Flag Fen and earlier than that, many tribes, not just in this country but all over the world, many tribes were either wholly nomadic or partially nomadic, and would spend at least part of the year following around one of the local herd animals, whichever animal they depended on for food, perhaps for milk, for skins, for bone, and so forth. In this country it would have been deer, but it can also be all sorts of various other herd animals being followed in different parts of the world. Those animals themselves are nomadic. They have their annual movements where they often go from one part of the land to another part of the land in search of different types of food and so forth. By and large, those animals tend to follow exactly the same patterns, exactly the same journeys year after year after year. And so the human hunters follow in the footsteps of the deer. So where the deer tread, humans tread. And in time, of course, following those same passages, same patterns, people would have pitched tent. They would have erected their humble sleeping places along the sides of these deer trods as they went along, particularly for long journeys, so they could be safe and warm and dry. And eventually those humble little temporary accommodations would have given way to roundhouses, permanent, quite intensive builds for the day, communities. And having created these more solid communities, and particularly as nomadic hunting was giving way to at first limited and then more extensive forms of agriculture, there would be people who would not be following the hunts but living on the sides of the deer-trod paths. They, in their turn, might want those paths to be more stable, to be more solid for the passage of larger numbers of people, and in time for the passage of horses, and in time for the passage of wheeled vehicles. And so what was once a deer-trodden path and then a foot-trodden path would have become a paved path. And over the centuries, some of those would have continued and continued and continued in use and be paved either with modern-day paving slabs now or be under tarmac. Not every road, quite clearly, but certain ancient roads may have been in use for thousands upon thousands of years and simply covered with different substances over the period of history. And even though the deer and other herd animals no longer follow those routes because let's face it, we've killed most of them off, nonetheless, we are still following those old routes. Is this what we understand by ley lines? These passages of energy that flow through the land, slithering and sliding like serpentine paths? Well, we know that birds can detect electromagnetic waves, and that when birds are migrating they follow pretty much the same route year in, year out. And they use these electromagnetic waves to guide themselves as they're flying from one country to another. Are birds the only animals that can detect these mysterious patterns of energy emanating from the earth? Or maybe if there is some pattern of energy emanating from the earth that these days we call a ley line, then perhaps some animals, maybe deer, maybe other creatures, can also detect them. So when they're following paths, they're not just following any old random path or just following whichever the easiest path is to get across the hillside. Maybe they are following a form of energy which is invisible to practically all humans. So some paths may be laid paths in that sense. And then the road takes on a whole new significance. There are also, for brief mention, corpse roads. It was a common practice with churches up until comparatively recently, especially rural churches, that they would have an entryway, a footpath, where the pallbearers would carry the coffin. So the coffin would be laid in a particular location, usually not too very far from the undertakers, and for the funeral, the pallbearers and the mourners would gather around it, and the coffin would be carried along what was referred to as a corpse road through the lich gate and into the church itself. But that road was only ever used for the carrying of corpses, and so there's all sorts of legends and folklore around what happens to silly people who decide to walk along a corpse road for no good reason when they're not participating in the funeral, and it's seldom an advisable thing to do. We've touched upon this issue of what happens to spirits once they're displaced already. Ita una faciamus. We may journey together. And that's what we're doing. We're journeying together through this talk. We're journeying together through life as friends, as acquaintances, as fellow walkers upon a spiritual path. Are some of those paths created by the very gods themselves? So Irish lore gives us the tale of Mananaun Machlir, the god of the ocean wave, who it is said caused 3 cows, a black cow, a white cow and a red cow, to emerge from the ocean. Underwater cows. Sounds like something from a Disney cartoon, doesn't it? Swimming cow. So they came out of the ocean onto the beach, and one cow wandered off in one direction, another in another, and the third in a different direction. And between them wandering back and forth across the land, they created the original 5 great roads, which ultimately led to Tara, the metaphorical centre of Ireland. It's not actually the geographical centre of Ireland, but it's that the hill of Tara is the spiritual centre of Ireland. And so they arrived, and you have the Shli Ajal, the Sli Mulacha, the Shli Kwalan, the Shlivor and the Shladala, the 5 great roads of Ireland created not by humans but by cows, directed by the gods themselves, or one of the gods themselves, by Manannán Mac Lir. And there are practices in a number of cultures that have been recorded in which an animal like a cow or a horse is sometimes hitched up to a wagon and then sent off wandering unsupervised so it can go wheresoever it feels like. And there are people following behind it, priests and priestesses and so forth, to see where it goes, to observe the path. It's almost like a form of divination. And often where the animal finally stops and comes to rest, that site, that spot, becomes a place of great significance. Maybe a place where they end up building a temple or declare it a holy site in some other shape, form or capacity. So what might seem like the mindless wandering of an animal is purposeful. A bit like the cows of Manannán Mac Lir. Possibly a bit like the deer being followed by the hunters. Is it purposeful rather than just random? Quo vadis, whither goest thou? What do we do next? What do you do next? Well, entirely up to you, but I can make a few suggestions. And yes, if anyone is a bit of a geek, you will instantly recognise the 10th Doctor, David Tennant, 10th incarnation of the great Lord of Time himself, in the companionship of Donna Noble, from an episode of Doctor Who called The Fires of Pompeii, where, having rescued one family from being incinerated in the volcano at Pompeii, that family relocated to a safer part of the Roman Empire, then create their own shrine to the household gods, the lares themselves, except their household gods are the Doctor and Donna, the ones who saved their lives, and their shrine is the TARDIS itself in the middle. And why not? Why they've not tried marketing this, I do not know, because I personally would certainly have bought a household shrine with the 10th Doctor and Donna Noble and the TARDIS on it. The Guardians are there to be worshipped, are there to be reverenced, worshipped, not in the fawning, boot-licking sense that was parodied by the Monty Python team in one of their films, but worshipped in the old Anglo-Saxon sense. We are shop to give value to shape a thing by valuing it, to be shaped by a thing that you value, a relationship that you value. So we give worth, we give value to those we reverence, to those for whom we light incense and pour out libations of wine or mead and leave offerings of food or whatsoever it is that they want. Probably jelly babies in the case of the Doctor. We make offerings to them because they protect us. Should you therefore be out, should we all be out as good little pagans, making offerings to the roads? Those of you who drive have a definite investment in making offerings to the roads. Those of us who are passengers have a definite investment in making offerings to the roads. And even those who wouldn't set foot in a car for love nor money will nonetheless benefit from the roads being used by lorries bringing forth the goods we purchase from shops. The trade routes, the back and the forth, the modern day version of the Silk Road. We all benefit in some shape, form or guise. So as much as we might dislike the pollution, as much as we might regret the loss of pristine woodland when it's ploughed under to make way for yet another flaming road, some of those roads, it doesn't mean we have to accept every road indiscriminately, but some of those roads are of enormous benefit to us, both in terms of bringing goods to shops, in terms of enabling us to get out and visit far distant places and friends and family, and in terms of things like ambulances being able to get to us when we're in dire need and whisk us off to hospital. Roads are tremendously important. And if you're at all animist in persuasion, then you will acknowledge that roads have their own souls, and those souls need to be valued. Everyone needs to be valued, needs to be acknowledged, needs to be respected, needs to have offerings of incense and wine and jelly babies and whatsoever else they might desire within reason. And so I'd like to encourage you to consider making an offering to your roads. Do it safely, don't get run over. Make an offering to your road spirits, to your compitales, to your crossroad spirits if you live near a crossroads. Offerings for safe journeys for yourself, offerings for safe journeys for others. Sit, commune, talk. Don't sit in the road, that's silly. But sit safely on the roadside and commune with the spirits of the roads. Let's resurrect this tradition. And should this extend beyond roads? What about those of us who travel frequently by train? Do train tracks have their own law, their own spirit of the railroad? Should there be little shrines at train stations where offerings can be made? If that doesn't freak out the train staff too much, we might even manage to get the trains running on time, because God alone knows these cretinous companies that the government has sold the railways off to dismally fail to get anything running on time. So perhaps the spirits can manage. What about airports? Are there airways? Planes tend to fly the same basic routes, so there is kind of like the notion of a road, I can't think of a better way to describe it, an air route that the plane flies back and forth on. So perhaps airports should have their own little shrines where we can pray to guardian spirits. Actually, most airports do have chapels already. So there is a place there to pray for the safety of those within the sky. And likewise seaports for those going across sea lanes, or for those barges that still run, that the canals themselves have their own sacred spirits and guardian spirits. Maybe one day when people are whizzing back and forth to colonies on the moon on a regular basis, there will be spaceports for which shrines are set up and the guardians of the space lanes are honoured. And maybe that's when someone will twig to manufacturing all sorts of icons for the Time Lord himself that we can... who better to guard the space lanes than the Doctor? I don't know. Which brings us, thankfully, to the end. Nunc est bibendum. Now is the time for drinking. I would ask you for questions, but there's no point because we can't see each other or hear each other. But you can always look up various books on the spirits of the roadside and do your own background reading, or even drop me an email if you really have some burning issue you want to know about. But thank you for listening, and hopefully, fingers crossed, see you in October if all of this wretched virus is sorted out by then and we can actually meet up properly in Colchester. Bye-bye.